This is a reading of the third applied Zen precept in its ordinary mind phrasing. I bear witness to the power of sexuality and its potential for both love and for harm in myself and in the world, and aspire to engage respectfully with an open heart in intimate relationships. To begin, an apology. Before I say anything, an apology. I'm an old white guy, and whoever you may be, dear reader, I'm not trying to speak for you. If at times that it seems that that's exactly what I'm doing, then my absolute and unconditional apology. Please tell me, let me know, and I'll try and do better. Come. Come. The Pali word used in the traditional phrasing of this precept doesn't only refer to sex, but rather includes all the different kinds of pleasure that come to us through our senses. All that we see and hear and taste and smell and touch, as well as our memories and imaginings, are part of karma, as too are what we would think of as the emotions of love and longing. Karma is there in the beauty we find in a tree, or the sound of birdsong, in the brush of a feather on our skin, the taste of chocolate, the smell of a rose, the memory of the first time I saw your face. Karma is our engagement with the world and is our turning towards this world of experiencing. Karma is our desiring. And yet, as traditionally practiced by lay people, the precept was rather about the listing of the kinds of women who were off limits sexually to the assumed to be male, assumed to be heterosexual Buddhist. All those women under the control of usually male family members, or who had been promised to a man. So, from the first, there is a tension in practicing this precept between considering the whole and infinite variety of our desire and pleasure and the rules of patriarchal sex. Sexual desire can arouse both our strongest sense of self, who I really am, the deepest part of me, and our most intense experience of loss of self in the immediacy of experience. There was no me, no you. So, our desiring is an excellent place to study the self, to study our selfing as self. As with all our study, it quickly becomes apparent that this selfing is never all about me, but about our relationships with other beings. Relationships that flow by way of images and assumptions, digital information and financial transaction, as much as by the simple coming together of bodies. For me, experiencing these feelings in this way, here and now, is sex even about sex at all? Am I looking for love, or looking for distraction? Perhaps I want to experience my own desirability through the eyes and body of another? Am I looking for soothing, care, safety, even if for me this shows up as sexual desire? For sharing intimacy, or the thrill of an anonymous encounter? The extremes of physical sensation, or for emotional fulfillment? For being comforted, or experiencing danger, the buzz of transgression? Do I feel I need validation through my conquests, someone whose passivity would give my own desire and my sense of self-worth and power free rein? Or a surrender of myself in surrendering my body to another's will? But how far are the desires or wishes I experience, how far are they in any real sense even mine? How far are they what someone of my age, my gender, my sexual orientation, is told, and nowadays shown, that they should, that they naturally want. Where do I go to learn about sex and for my relationship advice? My friends? Reality TV? The internet? Influencers? Watching porn? How do I think I know about how things should be? Whether that's in wanting to be normal or embracing some form of queerness. We all have stories in our heads about how things should be, or could be, or might have been. These stories rarely correspond to reality, but we'll usually try to manipulate our reality to fit the stories regardless. And then we end up blaming what goes wrong not on the stories we tell, but on the real-life human beings involved. Wherever we allow these stories about sex and relationships to become assumptions, whenever we frame them as requirements, whenever we experience our conforming to them or not conforming to them as shaming, and whenever someone is making a financial profit from telling us what to do, then real danger lurks. Our collective assumptions have clearly changed over time, often in contradictory ways, and in recent years the default seems to have shifted to the expectation that we should all always be wanting more and better sex, as we should want and be prepared to pay for more and better of everything else. So, should I be more adventurous, experimental, daring, and above all, am I missing out? Desiring. Desire is born in the mutual pleasure of play and discovery in our very first relationships. We could say relationship itself is born out of our desire. These pleasures of connection are of a subpersonal, molecular kind. The connecting up and stopping of different kinds of flow. The physical, but also deeply emotional pleasures of sucking, of burping, biting, squeezing, pooing, stroking and being stroked. All things we learn in relationship with our carers before we come to own them as ours, as another aspect of what makes me, me. The experience of filling, containing, holding and releasing, emptying, picking up or pulling towards, pushing or throwing away, putting outside, inside and inside, outside, the boundary that is rim, lips, whatever. All this experience through the sense of touch, of skin to skin, accompanied by smell and taste and sound. The enormous pleasure of looking, the wonder of shape and colour, looking as it brings us towards the experiencing of both self and other as relationship, making and breaking eye contact, making the world disappear and reappear, people, bringing a smile or laughter to the other, feeling the smile break across my own face, the joy of being contained, safely held, or of containing, holding the other. All of this is discovered in and as relationship, together with those through and with whom I find my sense of self. As I grow up, things both change and don't. Although the what and the where and the how and the when may change, fundamentally there are still the basic molecular connections, and my experiencing them as pleasure or sometimes pain. My desire and pleasure were formed in the evolving patterns of my gendering and sexuality. This is my lived experience, but framed by what I come to believe I should or should not feel, and what I should or should not do in response to what I feel. Our Zen practice shows that there is no single permanent I who is doing and experiencing all of this, but that what I think of as myself is made out of my experiencing these molecular pleasures, disciplined and canaled into a me that's still always shifting and discontinuous. Nevertheless, it's in my selfing as a sexual being that I feel perhaps most intimately me, who I am, or wish to be, or wish I wasn't. This overcoding of pleasure comes about through the habits we form and the approval, judgments and shamings we experience along the way. How my desiring becomes organised in relation to my own and other bodies identifies me, both for myself and for others, as a straight man, a lesbian, as a trans woman. But set against this is my inability entirely to control who I really am in terms of what I do and do not desire. When we talk about our desire as passion, we mean that in its true original sense. Desire finds me, draws me along in its wake. I don't get to choose where I feel its pull. Our sexuality confronts us with the real limits to our exercising control over what we think of as ourselves. It's never a case of simply deciding how I'm going to feel and then acting accordingly. We have to admit we don't always want to want what we want, or want what we want to want. Consent. My sense of self comes into being in relating to others, and what catalyses both self-sense and relationship is desire. I am not single but multiple, and neither am I separate and distinct from the world that contains you and every other being. So there is and can be no single owner for my desire. Yet this is exactly what both our legal system and so many of the stories we tell about sex take to be self-evident. Hence our ideas about consent assume that we're each entirely separate, free moral agents, free to make purely rational choices. Exactly as economics assumes we choose a sandwich or a new pair of shoes. Sexual consent is seen as an informal contract between equals, but as with my more formal contracts, the power is rarely equal on both sides. Cultural conventions shape what is expected or allowed and also shape the law itself. Rape within marriage was not legally recognised in the UK until 2003. It's probably not that important whether we choose Thai or Italian food on our first date. But is consent really just like choosing dinner? Is whether I want, or might be prepared to try, S&M, anal, choking, or a threesome, simply another list of possible menu choices? What would freedom to choose really mean here? Much of our desire is formed in micro-pleasures that, barely reach the threshold of conscious awareness. Desire strikes us from we know not where, and our passions sway us. Our own hormones have an equal or more profound effect on us than the drink or drugs that may accompany our sexual encounters. So how free are either you or I, really? If you hold a knife to my throat, any consent I might voice would clearly be null and void, but most encounters are more nuanced. Given men's expectations of the services to be offered by women, including sexual services, it seems men still routinely don't hear women or take seriously what women say. So, can you hear me if I say no? And do I have the courage? Do I think I have the right? Or even the self-awareness to? If I do consent, what about influence, pressure or threat, getting fired, having intimate images posted on the internet for the whole world to see? Or you simply threaten to dump me? Or that role, that contract, that promotion, that fancy present? Maybe the inequality of our positions is attractive in itself. Your money, your looks, the respect or envy you inspire, your greater experience. Or that you're my teacher, my coach, my therapist, my guru, my pop idol. I'm flattered to be noticed by somebody powerful, my vulnerability amplifying your pleasure. In the case of professional relationships, power carries the obligation not to abuse, but will that be respected? Grooming is the pretense of recognition and the pretense of relationship. Flattery presents the creation of an emotional dependency that slides through coercion into direct psychological and physical domination. This would all seem clear enough, absolutely so when the victims are children, and yet we know that victim blaming is rife, including by the police. She might be 12, but she was just that sort of girl, promiscuous. She, or more really he, remains unrecognised, even by the very authorities charged with keeping them safe. All of these aspects are highly gendered, meaning they apply differently depending on whether you're male or female. And while consent assumes we are all always equal, we have to remember that 90% plus of sexual violence is carried out by men on women, including trans women. Threat, influence, coercion, grooming, all these are overwhelmingly male actions towards women and children. All tend towards coercing consent or silencing its possible refusal. Differences in race, class, education, our relative affluence or poverty, all these also play an important point in whether we'll hear each other and whether we feel we have the right to refuse. And worse still, such inequalities will follow us into the courtroom where experience shows only too clearly that in reality we remain very unequal before the law. If consent gives both of us the idea that we're sharing control of our encounter and so taking a step towards actual trust, then, well, that's a good thing. But even with our consent, it doesn't mean that harming isn't being done. In assuming we always bring some kind of rational and self-responsible objectivity towards our desire for sex, we're in denial about the deluded and perhaps dangerously dissociated self-states that sexual desire provokes in us. This is simply and inevitably a large part of what sex is. Even while we objectively know that what we're drawn to is potentially or actively harmful, our facility for dissociation allows us to carry on regardless. We need to accept our own lack of self-transparency, the different levels of our wanting and not wanting. Doing so, the inescapable conclusion is that the premises on which our contract of consent is based, of separation, of self-consistency, and autonomous free choice, are simply false. Too often in the past, consent has been allowed to be assumed, and so a minimum requirement has to be that our consent is active and ongoing. But at best, consent still offers only a veneer of rationality. Yet, outside authentically mutual recognition in relationship, this contractual approach of our moment-by-moment consent still seems the best protection we have to offer. Recognizing relationship. For each of us, It was in the mutuality of relationship that we first found our own sense of self. In the sharing of pleasure in seeing, hearing, touching, tasting, smelling, as laughter, as the games we played, as the care that was shown to us. And also as the failure, the frustration, the fear, the anger, and the sense of separation that was healed as relationship was restored. Desire, seeking connection, was a part of all of this. Sharing together, we brought into being the space Jessica Benjamin calls the third, each recognising ourselves in our interaction with the other and the mutual joy this brings. Together, we created a safe space of sharing, of trust. Shared assumptions developed and tested by shared experience. Our adult relationships are like this too, although the third spaces we create together are more complex, as we now need fully social adult lives. Our desires too, overcoded and overwritten by the assumptions and requirements that have found their home in us, have become more complex and perhaps more self-contradictory. In attempting to live out the fantasies of what we imagine relationship is, whether that's of the perfect one-night stand or our raising a family together, our actual relationship in the here and now may come under strain. Our relationships are never something we establish once and for all and then simply maintain, but rather each relationship is lost and found again in a stronger form through the testing of this shared space of the third, the testing and strengthening of our shared trust. Relationship in this sense is dynamic rather than static. It evolves as we together do, as rupture is followed by repair. We still need and retain our relative autonomy, but not simply as compromise or limitation, because my own sense of being me depends on my recognition of you as being an other, but another who is still like me. We come to co-create a shared space that is safe, but not too safe, to borrow a phrase from psychoanalyst Philip Bromberg. A dynamic space where our interaction allows both of us to experience change. Hence all our previous work with the precepts points clearly to what makes for loving, intimate relationships. Our shared listening and speaking truthfully, our thinking about others with openness and possibility, our willingness to meet each other on equal ground, caring enough to dare to repair our inevitable ruptures, to rebuild the shared ground of relationship, coming to better experience as not separate. The difference is both between each other and the difference is within ourselves. This space of the possibility of possibility is where we can discover and define what relationship can be for us, both in this moment and as it develops. My own internal otherness can let me empathise with and appreciate both your otherness to me and your otherness within yourself. Our shared but different multiplicity. We can contrast this mutual kind of relationship to the contractual or fused forms into which it may well slip, or as which it may initially have begun. If we see our relationship as some kind of implicit contract, as with our consenting, then although we may accept the necessity of compromise, we each remain essentially separate. And both you and I judge our relationship primarily according to how it fulfills our own aims, what I want. I remain essentially unchanged as myself. My desire is my affair, and the success of our relationship will be measured by how your desire can be aligned with it. Our society actually steers us towards this kind of reciprocal but not mutual intimacy. And there are always going to be aspects of any relationship where we experience being caught between our fantasies and the hard and sometimes insoluble realities of our actual lives. If we see our relationship as a contract, then, given the inevitability of mismatch between us, can we compromise? Balance our desires for and requirements of the other? Achieve a workable reciprocal agreement? Can we negotiate a way forward? Or is it time to cancel the contract and pay the emotional and possibly financial price? Superficially, this approach couldn't be more different from our stories of true love, of our meeting the one, and living happily ever after. Already with Plato we find the fantasy of lovers fusing. We are two halves of one complete soul. And so we imagine, of course we want what the other wants. And there's the problem. Unable to distinguish each from other, the resulting enmeshment will be at best problematic, at worst disastrous. I misidentify myself with my mistaken image of you. For some inexplicable reason, you don't behave how I want you to. I may even say that deep down I know you really do want to. And I'm reduced to trying to dominate, coerce, or manipulate you, if only by way of agreeing to everything, into showing me love the way I want you to. I may decide that I'm a failure, irredeemably inadequate, or that you are somehow both my true love and an evil monster. Or I may decide I was simply mistaken. You are not the one. And so, I want my money back. I want to cancel what I now see as having been a contract all along. Neither contract nor fusion offer the mutuality of more genuine relationship. Our deeper mutual sense of relationship develops and evolves through time, as we come to know the other through ourselves and ourselves through the other. We only learn to be ourselves through relationship. And of course, learning to relate, learning how to do relationship is a massively important part of this. We can never consider sex in isolation from the whole of any relationship or from the totality of both our lives. In contemporary society, both employment opportunities and actual pay are still in practice highly gendered, and whether or not we have access to flexible working, part-time work and or job sharing, maternity and paternity leave, working from home, available and affordable childcare, all these will affect the way our relationship is impacted by our gender. Gendered attitudes strongly influence what we even think of as being work at all, with much of the caring entrusted to, or do I mean demanded of, women being unpaid or professionalised as unskilled and accordingly very poorly paid. What is included in our formal-informal caring? Who takes on what, or simply finds themselves tasked with what, unasked? Any and every aspect of our lives may make its presence felt in the form of our desiring or our absence of desire, as our different lived experience affects you and me differently. Because the nature of relationship is that it will always be work in progress, this is something we have to continue to learn, to practice with, to become. Nevertheless, provided we've had the experience of good enough relationship and served the other's very difference being the ground of their like-meness, then I have the ability to offer recognition to every other I meet or encounter, to offer the recognition that they are like me, but not me. Recognition as the possibility of a relationship between us that is more than contractual, that is based on more than our reciprocal misidentification. Recognition that includes awareness of our shared vulnerability, our shared embodiment, and so our shared mortality, our nature as suffering beings, and hence also as being capable of joy, of pleasure, of fulfillment, of ecstasy. Recognition that when I fail to recognise and respect these in the other, then I also deny them in myself, and with it deny the basis of my existence as myself. This recognition can be partial, stuttering, sometimes one-sided, and can be withdrawn or denied. We may think we've offered the other proper recognition, only sudden to see, whether in the moment or in hindsight, that our assumptions and habits have led us to treating this other as less than, as reduced to my misidentification of them. Can we, if our mistake is pointed out to us, find renewed trust in the shared space of our mutuality, whether in the meeting of eyes, the sharing of a joke, or starting that difficult conversation with an open heart and an open mind? Otherness and othering. Recognising each other isn't all or nothing. While we're all aware of some of the ways we other particular people or even whole groups, from overt racism or homophobia to just keeping our distance from people not like us, othering doesn't have to be hateful or hostile, and in fact we frequently other within relationship, and often without really being aware we're doing so. In our inevitable assumptions and requirements of each other, we place limits on the possibilities of relationship between us, and where those assumptions and requirements are based on some supposed fundamental difference between us, then our othering opens the door not only to breakdown, but also to all forms of domination, coercion, and manipulation, whether recognised as such or not. First and foremost amongst these differences across continents and over the past several thousand years is gender. Being a woman and being a man are about so much more than the relatively minor anatomical differences between those of us assigned male and assigned female. It's not so long since women were effectively owned by fathers or husbands, and increasing formal legal equality hasn't and will not cancel out existing and inbuilt inequalities or transform entrenched attitudes any day soon. The ways in which gender has for so long shaped our culture show up in what and how we desire, both as what we find desirable in the other and in what we experience as desirable or otherwise in ourselves. In some ways, the pace of change in our collective desiring can seem quite rapid, for example, in the way sexual attitudes now seem much more permissive than a couple of generations ago, or in the effects on us of social media. But at a deeper level, change is glacial, and much in contemporary culture seems to reinforce rather than challenge existing attitudes. This is important because it affects both our most casual social encounters and our most significant and lasting relationships. I have, consciously or unconsciously, assumptions and requirements that have been shaped by inequality generation after generation, and in ways that may be obvious or barely noticeable, we treat each other accordingly. I identify you as man or woman before I register anything else about you. And in fact, the way we see each other and the way we present ourselves to be seen are both shaped fundamentally by gender. Appearing and acting. Here's the critic John Berger writing in the early 1970s about the male gaze in a way that, if anything, has come to seem more relevant with the passing decades. The social presence of a woman is different in kind from that of a man. A man's presence is dependent on the promise of power which he embodies. By contrast, a woman's presence expresses her own attitude to herself and defines what can or cannot be done to her. Her presence is manifest in her gestures, voice, opinions, expressions, clothes, chosen surroundings, taste. To be born a woman has to be born within an allotted and confined space, into the keeping of men. The social presence of women has developed as a result of their ingenuity in living under such tutelage within such a limited space. But this has been at the cost of a woman's self being split in two. A woman must continually watch herself. She is almost continually accompanied by her own image of herself. From earliest childhood, she's been taught and persuaded to survey herself continually. She has to survey everything she is and everything she does, because how she appears to others, and ultimately how she appears to men, is of crucial importance for what is normally thought of as the success of her life. Her own sense of being in herself is supplanted by a sense of being appreciated as herself by another. One might simplify this by saying men act and women appear. This determines not only most relations between men and women, but also the relationship of women to themselves. The surveyor of woman in herself is male, the surveyed female. Thus she turns herself into an object, and most particularly an object of vision, a sight. That's John Berger in Ways of Seeing. This male gaze is the most immediate and inescapable way we experience the gendering of our desire as masculine and feminine, a gendering that is inevitably asymmetrical and unequal. We all practice self-surveillance, and we all divide the world into subjects who see and objects to be seen. But in our gendered culture, the assumption is that it will be men looking at women. While a man actively looks, a woman exists to be seen by men. Hence the male gaze is already a kind of domination, but one we normally experience as being simply natural, at least or unless or until it becomes intrusive as staring, catcalling, or worse. How we express our gender is central to the way we actually experience being a woman or being a man. Hence how I experience myself and how I am experienced by others. And this includes what we respond to as beauty or as sexually arousing. All of these are caught up in this structure of the gaze. There is a subtle interplay here, not direct domination through coercion, but a reciprocal and highly asymmetrical coming to be of our desire. Expressing my gender is part of experiencing myself as me, and growing up we each navigated acceptable and unacceptable expressions of our assigned gender and were rewarded, corrected, or shamed accordingly. However much or little we personally might wish to embody traditional gender expectations, it's this gendered world that has formed us and within which we must find ways of living out fulfilling relationships. selling bodies. Never in the history of the world have there been so many images presented to us for our pleasure, to explore, scan and enjoy. Images we both desire in themselves and for what is shown to us in them. Images that are implicitly also presented to us as models, ideals and fantasies, and images that demand too that we pay for them in one way or another. These images show us what we are to desire in and of others and what it is to be desirable ourselves. In our culture of gendered vision, this is overwhelmingly about men looking at women's bodies. One of John Birch's key points about the male gaze is that it operates in the same way across our high and popular culture and pornography and other forms of sex work. So if Birch's argument still applies, and I'd argue strongly that if anything it's more true in the 2020s than the 1970s, then how pornography represents the female body will help us understand how our current deluge of images of desirability shapes our desire itself. Pornography has become vastly more important and influential since the development of digital imagery that allows any image to be infinitely reproduced. We're still in the relatively early days of the internet and of social media, but we all now have instant access to pornography that in terms of both quantity and content would have been unavailable to anyone even 30 years ago. It's unclear whether pornography is itself driving the increasing sexualization of imagery generally, or whether it's simply a part of it. Perhaps 10% of global websites are devoted to pornography, with the largest, Pornhub, being by one measure the world's fourth most visited website. And it's been suggested that pornography is the subject of a similar percentage of our internet searches on mobile phones. Pornography is the renting for sex of virtual bodies, overwhelmingly women's bodies, commercialized for the male gaze. It's now normal for the algorithms that govern online content feeds to offer violent and misogynistic pornography to children and to young adults. Whether this experience is directly traumatic for them or not, they're growing up with the sense that what they see online is what sex is. What happens when we take this performance of sexual performance as how sex actually is in real life, as what everyone does? Real life sex now moves towards being an attempt to recreate, to reenact the image that we've seen on the screen. To borrow a term from cultural theory, sex has become its own simulacrum. Pornography's highly contrived displaying of bodies, specific acts, gestures and vocalizations is for many now becoming the real thing, as the distinction between real sex and making images of sex collapses. Real life sex becomes just a minor category of acted out pornography. A sexual image offers us visual overstimulation, but without there being any response from the other. It offers us the instant pleasure of visual possession of the female body, but only momentarily. There's none of the mutual relationship central to our deeper sense of self. Pornography's controlling and dominating gaze wears itself out, and what was exciting stops being so, becomes flat, hollow. Hence its insatiability, the need for the new, the same but different, the more. This more may be more in quantity, more explicit, more extreme. The AI deepfake offers us the perfected form of pornography, endless variations on a simulacrum of the body in a simulacrum of sex. The deepfake image, whatever pleasure its viewing may bring, is about taming the potential power of women's agency over her own body or over her speech, taming it into a fantasy of possession and control, whether she's Taylor Swift, your classmate, your work colleague. Although there have been many attempts to disrupt, ironize, challenge or subvert the male gaze in pornography, 99% of it strictly follows the same formula because this is what sells. Sells largely and presumably because of the pleasure that many, many millions of mainly men and less so women find in it, however problematic the form of that pleasure is. The form whereby all the molecular micro-pleasures of looking come to be overcoded as forms of domination. Viewing the image, we control it and by extension the woman depicted. But it would seem this level of domination simply isn't enough, and pornography very often represents or even records direct domination over the woman's body as humiliation, as threat, as pain, as actual violence. Just how much pornography actually includes some form of misogynistic violence? I've seen varying estimates of what percentage of pornography should be described as misogynistic violence, and it's clearly high, perhaps even most. But that this is hard to quantify is actually part of the problem. There is no clear line between consensual play at violence, realistic representations of violence, and actual violence itself. Playing at domination is still part of this gender game, part of the real-life domination that gender organises as both our economic reality and our desire. Real-life female partners can hence be expected, required, to consent to whatever has been seen online, to want it, and to express enjoyment in similar ways to the women represented. Allowing their partial strangulation during sex is now, at least in popular imagination, normal, or even required of women, even what women want, and so now what many routinely experience. Pornography is now mainstream. Many, many billions of viewers, billions in profit for the hosting platforms. On the non-commercial fringes of pornography are other kinds of intimate images, absolutely violating the real women whose bodies are shown. Upskirting, recently made illegal in the UK. Hidden cameras in women's changing rooms, often those of professional athletes. Are the men who do this fundamentally different from the rest of us in being sick or perverted individuals? Or are they better seen as simply acting out in more extreme form the basic domination of the male gaze? Denying mutual recognition and the woman's agency, reducing her to an object, placing the viewer in a pleasurably dominant position. We'd have to call all this kind of image theft overtly misogynistic, and indeed, with revenge porn, this becomes quite explicit. Intimate images circulated online with the specific intent of shaming and traumatizing. The female body has become not only a source of pleasure, but also the site of inflicting emotional pain. And this pleasure is now intimately connected to that pain. This version of the male gaze overcodes, if you like, hijacks the simple micro-pleasures of looking, to the point where in these darker forms it becomes purely pathological, seeing as possession, as a forced symbolic penetration. This is the point at which visual pleasure has become rape culture. Violence against women and girls. Everyone is talking about AI these days, and I've no wish to join the hype, but the no rules, no boundaries world of virtual reality can show us something of the underlying direction and structuring of our own very real world. Here's Laura Bates, here of the Everyday Sexism website, writing about Chub AI, a website where users can chat with AI bots and roleplay violent and illegal acts. For as little as $5 a month, users can access a brothel staffed by girls below the age of 15, described on the site as a world without feminism. Or they can chat with a range of characters, including Olivia, a 13-year-old girl with pigtails wearing a hospital gown, or Reiko, your clumsy older sister, who is described as constantly having sexual accidents with her younger brother. This is just one of the thousands of applications of this new technology that are re-embedding misogyny deep into the foundations of our future. Sex robots are being developed at breakneck speed. Some manufacturers have dreamed up a frigid setting that allows their users to simulate rape. Millions of men are already using AI companions, virtual girlfriends available and subservient 24/7, whose breast size and personality they can customize and manipulate. Nearly 9 in 10 women polled in a 2020 Economist study said they restricted their online activity in some way as a result of cyber harassment, hacking, online stalking and doxing. That's Laura Bates writing in The Guardian, 3rd of June 2025. This is clearly taking male fantasy and the reality of their control of women to the next level. We can't disconnect the pleasure of the fantasy from the reality of silencing actual women. This is masculinity as, actually as fear of actual mutual relationship, where the only pleasure left to us is through sexual domination, raping my sex robot or a 13-year-old avatar. Any real adult woman, by experiencing and wanting to act on her own desire, her own wants, needs, ideas, fears, and all that makes any of us actually human, becomes a threat to masculinity's inflated self-image and hence the need to reduce, contain, remake woman as an object that can be safely desired, a femininity that can be compliant or resistant as individual men require. The child woman. Patriarchy has always treated women and children for many purposes as being the same, both seen as physically weaker and less capable of rational thought than men, and so as being vulnerable and in need of masculine protection, for which is always read control. Adult and child come to parallel man and woman, and with the equation of man equals adult and woman equals child, our childlike women become required to accept their natural dependency on adult men to be looked after, to be protected, but also to be obliged to provide whatever kinds of service are demanded of them. Traditionalists, now including trad wives, have in fact taken this as a feminine ideal. There has been an important shift in recent decades in how this shows up in our visual culture, in the way this eliding of the difference between adult and child has come to be imaged. Contemporary visual culture increasingly blurs the line between self-responsible female adults and dependent children, so that while once there was a clear distinction between the self-presentation of girls and of women through, amongst other things, style of clothing, hair, and the presence or absence of makeup, this has been eroded through the marketising of the appearance of the youthful female body to be the universal standard of desirability for the male gaze, and so to women's actual self-presentation, self-imaging, and their sense of what it is to be themselves. Though all appearance plays a game of the pleasurable tension between concealing and revealing the body, Overall, the male gaze seeks the availability division of the female body as both pleasurable in itself and as a promise of physical availability. Bared flesh, fabrics that stretch to mould to and reveal the body's shape, styles and cuts that emphasize crotch, buttocks, breasts. Tightness emphasizes restriction of movement, and the perpetual attraction of high heels confirms the point. The most sexually attractive and available woman is the one who cannot run away. This body, and particularly the ideal face, appear above all youthful. And the infinite pains are to be taken in investing in the purchasing of maintaining and perfecting the appearance of youth, of being a child. We could go on the emphasis on big eyes, for example. This body also appears youthful because it's thin. Perhaps nowadays the thinness of the toned athlete, but definitely thin, girl thin, child thin. Impossible here not to mention the shaming role of diets and female starvation and self-starvation, now supported by the use of weight loss drugs as a tool to maintain an exaggerated thinness. We've already referenced Cathy O'Neill's The Shame Machine, who profits in the new age of humiliation, where she draws on her own experience about the double bind whereby women are expected to discipline themselves out of the pleasure of food in the name of a to be desired, yet for most unachievable, thinness. This body's youthfulness is also shown by its being hairless, nothing being allowed to disrupt the display of invitingly smooth, unblemished skin, again displaying the characteristics of the girl as child. As this version of femininity emphasises extreme youth and thinness, almost frailty, as an index of desirability, hence it was entirely logical for mainstream fashion magazines of the recent past to use girls as young as 12 as being the perfect embodiment of skinny, feminine vulnerability, using them to model sexy adult women's clothes. If our ideal of attractiveness is to be young and skinny and vulnerable, then the 12-year-old may well be as or more attractive by this standard, with unconscious male anticipation of the compliance and service expected of the girls being also a child. A recent World Health Organization report suggests that globally, almost 1/3 of women and girls aged 15 to 49 have experienced physical or sexual violence from an intimate partner. We might ask about why this stat doesn't separate adults from children, women from girls. I think the answer is that our still dominant patriarchal version of masculinity has difficulty telling the difference. Male sexual predation on children is nothing new, obviously, and it's a huge real-life problem. Globally, it's estimated that 1 in 8 children have been victims of some form of online child sexual abuse, CSA. The non-consensual taking, sharing and exposure to sexual images and videos, or of sexting, unwanted sexual questions and unwanted requesting of sexual acts. That's more than 1 in 10 of the world's children being treated as objects of sexual violence, violence that the perpetrators know to be illegal. In surveys across the United States, Britain and Australia, around 1 in 10 men admitted online sexual offending against children at some point in their lives, while a figure equivalent to many millions of men across all 3 countries said they would seek to commit contact sexual offences against children if they knew no one would find out, with evidence from Australia suggesting that around 1 in 5 adult men either have sexual feelings for children under 18 or have actually offended against them, while perhaps 1 in 20 of UK children have been victims of contact sexual abuse, almost all by parents, siblings and extended family. This skews dramatically towards older rather than younger children, and towards girls over boys, peaking at around 1 in 6 for preteen and teenage girls. If we include non-contact CSA, then it's perhaps 1 in 4 girls, 1 in 4 female children. The adult male fantasy of the sexy schoolgirl shows how we collectively acknowledge and simultaneously disavow this. Even if we dismiss it as just a bit of fun, and even if adult women play along on hen nights or as fancy dress, we still confirm rather than deny the underlying structure. A schoolgirl is by definition under 16, the UK age of consent. The young female body, actually young or maintained as young looking, has become the benchmark of desirability itself. This body is offered to our gaze as accessible, as non-threatening and as silent, able to be controlled either through force or willingly complicit. We might think about the ongoing global pandemic of street harassment here, and whether we're talking about female children or adult women, what is being required, and the frustration of which may well increase the actual risk. What's being required by the men doing it is complicity in a form of pleasure as domination, whether that's as the intrusive male gaze, as sexualised language, or actual physical contact. In a UK commissioned survey, only 3% of UK women aged 18 to 24 said they hadn't experienced some form of sexual harassment in public places. I apologise for the stats, but they're important, they're necessary. Bodies selling. Sexualised imagery is now a part of selling pretty much everything. Every product made, every service on offer. The pleasure of the male gaze has become directly monetised in a global market, created using the same range of digital platforms crucial to the evolution of contemporary pornography. Websites, social media platforms and other apps, all equally accessible from your smartphone, tablet or computer, all actively promoting content on their feeds that their algorithms determine will increase advertising revenue. Your clicks equal their money. The rise of these digital platforms has led to the elision of boundaries, not just between what would have until recently been considered hardcore and softcore pornography, but also between what is and isn't considered pornography at all. There is now simply a continuum of more and less sexualised images of young women's bodies. For example, the presentation of female performance in the music videos, so central to their own promotion and to the music industry as a whole, inevitably positions them in relation to this basic structure of the sexualised male gaze. Their presentation as being themselves strong, independent, in control and even sexually dominant, the evidence for which is the ability of a few performers to make millions, still relies on the presentation or exploitation of the female body as a kind of natural resource. This is a very liberal, entrepreneurial version of feminism. Exploit your potential capital to succeed in life. In the same vein, the OnlyFans app allows producer users to sell their own sexualised images, all of which frames the self-image of all young women as they inevitably have to position themselves in terms of the form and degree of their own self-sexualisation within a world of highly competitive female desirability. Following Berger, in each of these very different kinds of imagery, we find the same basic structure of objectification and possession. Perhaps the perspective of someone who's native to two very different cultural responses to the male gaze might offer some insight. Here is Nadine Asbali responding to claims that Muslim women are oppressed by wearing the hijab. It's disingenuous to pretend that Muslim women are uniquely prone to victimhood. Can we truthfully say anything about the way women are expected to lead our lives isn't rooted in patriarchy, whether it's the bikini or the push-up bra, miniskirts or high heels. As women, we are conditioned to shape our identity under the watchful eye of the male gaze. That's Nadine Asbali in The Guardian, 20th of June 2025. Interesting that Asbali chooses the miniskirt, the visual icon of the swinging 60s and its liberated sexuality, and one that's maintained its currency ever since. By wearing the mini as skirt or dress, a young woman shows herself as having command over her own sexuality, but does so by displaying her body as being available to the male gaze and implicitly touch, in a style of dress or skirt traditional for female children to wear before puberty, the dress even known as a baby doll. No coincidence that the model associated with Minnie was Twiggy, eponymously named for her stick-thin limbs, flat chest and huge cold eyes. The girl claims her independence to desire for herself by, paradoxically, conforming to men's image of the girl as biddable childwoman. And yet, there is ambiguity and ambivalence in not yet being fully integrated into an adult world where masculine and feminine play only their prescribed roles. The girl's unfinished and so potentially unlimited and so radically other. Will she defy the implicit attempt to always sexualise her and demand simply to be taken on her own terms? Whether consciously or not, will she call on her potential sexual power, find ways of using it that are neither simply passive or attempting to exploit the exploiter in return? Think of the many different versions of girl power. The guerrilla girls, riot girls and girls, and the commercially complicit but much loved Spice Girls. And of course that Union Jack mini dress. The ambiguity of herself being still always a girl offers the adult woman too this potential space of otherness. The poet Ruth Bedell titled her most recent collection of poems simply Girl, fascinated by how this identity, although itself constructed by men, still offers the possibility of holding off, pushing back against, contesting our assumptions of what it is to be a woman, or, for that matter, what it is to be a man. And so the girl, whether she's wearing a miniskirt or hijab, studying nuclear physics or out with her mates, embodies the complexity of where we all find ourselves caught up by forces not of our own making and made to play the game by their rules, compromised, and yet creating new possibilities for hope and joy and relationship. Masculinity and mastery. Our contemporary paradigm of gender, of masculinity and femininity, is not some relic of a patriarchal past, nor is it in any way natural or just the way things are. In our modern societies, masculinity takes the form of mastery, a way of understanding and acting which at the limit takes the whole world as potential object to its subject. Every other, whether human or other being or natural resource, becomes a mere thing, to be known, catalogued and exploited, to be used and used up, to be consumed. All others, other genders, other races, other classes, other abilities, are there to be of service and to be used, or to be dismissed as useless. Hence permanent and ever more efficient expropriation and exploitation, and also genocide, displacement, the erasure of the unwanted. We're all a part of this, however simultaneously willing and unwilling. Mastery shows up in our economic and political organisation, in our core philosophical assumptions, and as masculinity, even in what we experience as desirable, attractive, sexy. And so in our pleasures, our joys, our ecstasies. However, mastery's contradictions mean that its very need to dominate brings about its own failure, not only in the limitation in our own experiencing of the possibilities for genuine intimacy and relationship, but also as existing levels of social inequality that fuel ever greater inequality and the exploitation of the natural world that's leading to climate collapse and the destruction of entire ecosystems. So, against our society's stumbling but real progress towards formal gender equality, the current resurgence of traditional or even hypermasculinity within the online manosphere, well, it shouldn't really surprise us. We've already heard from Laura Bates on the AI world, but for another influential contemporary version of masculinity taken to the limit, we might look at, say, Andrew Tate's hugely popular YouTube and Instagram content, his online courses and seminars on how to get rich and get women. This is a world of hyper-masculinity, and one that offers us a highly gendered and highly exploitative image of male and female relationships. Tate's own initial route to celebrity was as a cage fighter, and his career since has been in selling. And this is finally more about money than anything else. An image of masculinity as lifestyle, money, women, cigars, and cars. The hypermasculinity of the all-conquering warrior hence requires as its complement a sexualized and enforceably submissive hyperfemininity. Here, to be a man is to exercise the power that goes with being wealthy, to have objects you possess, amongst which, well, women figure as particular possessions to be used or traded. To be a man within this world is to be able to impose your will on others by whatever means. The physical violence of the man-on-man cage fight and the man-on-woman of domestic abuse, slapping and choking as required, are just different modes of showing who is master. Let's pause for a moment here to remember that in real life, 1 in 4 adult women, 1 in 4 adult women have been subject to one or multiple forms of such domestic abuse. To truly be a man is to compete with all other men and to be able to display the fruits of victory. It's a clear and simple message. Women will not look at a weakling, but will admire your domination of them. Life is perpetual struggle. We should all take the fantasized nobility of the ancient warrior as our true ideal. Even to challenge this for a moment is to show oneself as cucked, cuckolded, and so as feminized, as being no man at all, which is of course one of the most traditional and universal ways men use to shame other men in the contest for status amongst themselves. Tate's repetitive self-promotion, like that of every other hustler, is actively marketed and sold for profit by the visually based digital platforms that host it. Far from being in any way neutral over questions of content, the algorithms these platforms use to control the content they feed individual users actually promote controversial material that will provoke a reaction from the viewer. The sole reason these platforms exist is to sell advertising, and each time we click, they profit. Clicks equal advertising revenue. Behind the image of the heroic warrior as master, the true struggle is, as always, simply that for money as status. Regardless, the effect of the penetrations of Tate's and similar misogynist postings on social media and the internet, many billions of views, should not be underestimated. Tate and his fellow hustlers are selling a high contrast version of our existing and long established collective image of the relation between masculinity and femininity, where masculinity equals mastery. We might remember James Gilligan's work with those held in prison in the US. The expression of violence, and specifically of sexual violence, always carried the symbolic meaning, I am not a woman. The frequent instances of male-on-male rape in prison having the message, I am a man because I have made you into a woman. Our system of gender has always worked to normalise, naturalise and perpetuate inequality. And in this respect, Tate is a true prophet. Inequality here is the point. For the true master, real equality can only ever be experienced as his being himself oppressed. I was born into and raised within our culture of masculinity, which means that it's not necessary for me to believe in or agree with any of its promises or commands in order to find myself acting, or more often as having acted, as if I did. To have been raised as and to be seen as a man does bring with it a certain self-sense and assumption of entitlement, and in retrospect I think that sometimes, often, I've required to be so treated and actually have been. But as I've tried to emphasise, mastery is ultimately self-contradictory in that what it forever seeks, recognition by the other, connection, is exactly what it denies itself by treating everyone else as things, as objects to be controlled. Ask Trump, ask Putin and the rest if they ever have enough, ever are enough. So paradoxically, to be a real man is also always to experience oneself as lacking and so having something to prove. Masculine entitlement has to be exercised either in direct competition with other men or as receiving the compliance and service of women. Hence, masculinity as mastery is far from being what it imagines, the assertion and enjoyment of virile strength, but rather the expression of our fear, of the shame, of actually experiencing what we think of as our weakness, our vulnerability, our need for care. What runs our culture of masculinity is, finally, nothing more than a desperate and often wildly destructive attempt to avoid our potential shame. For example, in my decades spent as a prison chaplain, I knew men who'd been convicted of sexual assault against older female children, often those in a step relationship or similar. Rather than taking pleasure in what was in reality their domination and exploitation of their victims, or having feelings of hatred or hostility towards them, most had, in their own terms, been looking more for emotional support and a closeness lacking in other relationships. Few seemed really to understand the actual harm done to their victims, either in the degree of trauma inflicted or the duration of its effects. That we can understand this kind of CSA as, at one and the same time, a criminal form of violent domination and a reaching out for emotional support and human warmth, points to the complex interaction of status and shaming. If my relationships with actual adult others have become too status insecure, or I'm even fearful of them, then the child, as a both symbolically and physically weaker and a seemingly welcoming, even obligated, other, may appear to offer a less status-threatening and less self-shaming path for my desire, at least until I'm exposed to the shame of public view. The same applies to the many ordinary and family men who pay sex workers for sex. By making the exchange contractual, men avoid the shaming they might experience in a relationship between equals. When men try to escape their vulnerability to the shame of appearing vulnerable, it's up to women, and sometimes children, to soothe it away. Women repeatedly find themselves tasked with dealing with men's shame as part of the many forms that their service takes, not only as housework, childcare or sex, but also as emotional service, listening, soothing, reassuring. This is all gendered work, unpaid and often unrecognised. Whenever, as a man, I'm actively shamed by others or simply experience shame at my own perceived lack or failure, patriarchy assures me that I should expect women to offer me these compensatory services, and I will experience myself as failing further if I don't get them. And so I'm further shamed as a man. Proving my masculinity through violence, in whatever form, is the required symbolic response. Thus, domestic abuse by a partner might take the form of physical violence, as assault, as rape, the psychological violence of shaming, gaslighting or coercive control, the threat of or actual violence towards other family members, often the children. As already noticed, estimates suggest that 1 in 4 adult women have been subject to one or often more of these forms of abuse. For women to be violent is to be unfeminine according to the logic of gender. And so when women are shamed by men, by each other, by self-contradictory, media-led expectations and perceived requirements, they usually send it inwards as insecurity, low self-esteem, depression, self-harm. Heads women lose and tails women lose. And of course, men lose too. And that's an important point. But not in the same way. And when men do lose, women will still, somehow, often end up paying the price. Rebecca Solnit in The Guardian, 3rd of August 2025. This violence is everywhere, and it deeply shapes or misshapes our society. All girls and women are impacted by the reality that so many men want to harm us, and these crimes could happen to any one of us. This violence affects the choices we make about where to go and when, what jobs to take, when to speak up, what to wear. The threat of violence and actual violence by some men against some women and girls establishes female vulnerability and fear and disempowerment far more broadly. The problem is systemic, and the answer isn't police and prison. It's social change, and societies will have changed enough when violence against women ceases to be a pandemic that stretches across continents and centuries. That's the excellent Rebecca Solnit that said in The Guardian, 3rd of August 2025. Feeling our own hurt. Can we instead bring at least the possibility of mutual recognition to every meeting, every encounter, both those which are sexual and those which are not? As the complex embodied beings we each are, unless we recognise our own vulnerability together with that of the other, our capacity to inflict or suffer further harm is hugely increased. We can't really meet each other while we're hiding from ourselves, so that as well as recognising the harm that we have done, we also need to bear witness to our own vulnerability and to ask about our own experience of being harmed. In our society, vulnerability and weakness are always shaming. And because so much of our social shaming is sexual in nature, this is especially so around sex. None of us want to think of ourselves as victims, but it's exactly here, in relation to intimacy that this work is most essential? Can we even recognise as harm what we've suffered? Are we able to give it its name? It's only in very recent years that attempts, of which the #MeToo movement has been an important part, to clarify what we might mean by sexual assault and actual rape have allowed the real scale of these harms to begin to come to light, and for individual women to acknowledge to themselves, perhaps only years after the event, that no, that was not my fault. It did not just happen. It was rape. And so begin properly to process their experience. And of course, although rape is overwhelmingly committed on women, male rape exists too. And because suffering rape runs so counter to our accepted image of what it is to be a man, it can even be harder to acknowledge publicly or privately. But it's also very important to understand that hurt, in this sense, does not have to be a result of something criminal done to us or even someone's bad intent. Our hurt may not even include anything physical done to or by us. The words of others can wound deeply. So many of our slurs derive from sex, and so much of shaming as teasing, banter or horseplay is sexualized and sexualizing what I perceive as my undesirable body. Undesirable to whom? How did I come to believe this? May lead to a deep sense of insecurity and hurt. Perhaps it's my own failure to meet my own expectations or requirements of how I should feel or perform. And perhaps shame is a particular problem here. Or what I should experience, or even what I imagine the other's expectations of me are. Again, how did I come by these assumptions, beliefs, judgments? Hurt in relationship may not require blame. And my suffering is no less real if it arises from the unwelcome consequences of my own admitted misjudgments. Or it may come from a mismatch of unvoiced expectation. We wanted different things, but didn't necessarily even know we wanted different things until the moment the situation arose. Perhaps our differing libidos mean we don't desire each other in the same way. However we respond, there may well be hurt on both sides. Important too to recognise the hurt that comes from our having harmed others. In hurting others, we also deeply hurt ourselves. Our shared vulnerability is at the heart of our practice. Our experience of hurt is the basic condition of our empathy for others. And in bearing witness to our own hurt, we become better able to bear witness to the hurt done to others. Can I stand with others who experience harm? Feeling our own hurt allows our experiencing of ourselves as more whole, more human. Thich Nhat Hanh used to say he would not wish to live in a world without suffering, because without it we would not have the emotional resources genuinely to recognise and to relate to any other. Relationship beyond mastery. I'll note here some of the many things I should have, and in a more extended treatment would have, talked about. Sexual difference. I'm hoping you're happy with the idea that while gender is, obviously, a historically evolving social contract, this doesn't presuppose any specific view of its relationship to sexual differentiation and to biology. I've not said much at all about motherhood, that most important task of human life, where the abstract structure of gender intersects with the lived bodily experience of actual women. What kind of support are you offered if you choose motherhood, and whatever your choices? How far are you able to exercise control over your own body, whether that's as contraception, abortion or IVF? I've not talked about trans or non-binary or even gay or lesbian experience directly, but confine myself to trying to outline the basic symbolic social structure within which we all live our lives. Lives which for all of us in reality exceed and overflow that structure, the more so for those of us who have no simple place within it. I've also not found space to explore the crucial intersections of our gender with those other lines of identity by which our society differentiates and discriminates against us. Race, wealth, education, disability, sexuality, and the many other forms of othering. I would have dearly liked to have explored at least something of the range of often contradictory feminist responses to the commercialisation of sexuality. Can doing sex work for money actually represent a liberation of female sexuality against patriarchal and bourgeois norms? Is it woman's responsibility to exploit her sexual capital to the max? Does sex positivity mean that every woman ought to explore every possible sexual variation in her search for personal fulfillment? Or, as perhaps more politically aware feminists argue, are these just further examples of women providing yet more of the sexual labour they have long provided together with so many other forms of labour and care? Okay, so while for the individual this is up to each woman to decide, as a society, such questions concern us all. Our gendering divides us both one from another and within ourselves. By defining masculinity and masculine desire in terms of subjectivity, agency and control, and defining it in opposition to a femininity as service, where a woman's desire and agency are reduced to desiring to be of service and to desiring to be a desirable body, neither side can recognise either self or other. There can be no meeting and relating with openness and possibility. And yet, of course, we are never only this. In our capacity for joy, for pleasure and for suffering too, we're far more than these roles allotted to us by the workings of gender. Our earlier discussions explored the paradoxical role of identity in relationship, that all relationships presuppose identities of some kind, but that these identities are also always misidentifications in that they limit the openness and possibility of our mutual coming to be. By containing relationship within a reciprocal I am this and you're that. So, do I recognise you in a limited way as a woman or as a man, together with the assumptions, expectation, behaviours that identification brings with it? Or do we recognise us instead as the openness and possibility of a not knowing that we, as vulnerable, mortal, embodied, sentient beings, always already are, and may together further become in our relationship? We each have to navigate a path through this gendered world that has shaped us and shaped our desiring, a path that's at the same time individual and collective, uniquely our own and shared with others. This paradigm of masculinity and femininity seems surprisingly resilient, and yet it's constantly being renewed and reproduced through each of us, which means, of course, that it's always changing, reinvented for better and for worse. Precisely because mastery is ultimately inimical to the genuine relationship by which we mutually become ourselves, our actual relationships always exceed, overflow, outwit the limitations of gender. And in fact, every limitation is itself an invitation to find fresh opportunities for resistance, evasion, freedom. For me, here, now, what is a successful life? None of us are straight in Maastricht's sense. And however we identify, all of us are girl, all of us are queer in the infinite possibilities we may still find for joy in the interstices of our own complicity in this compromised but wonderful world. So, to pose some questions for myself, and perhaps also for all who, like me, were raised to be men. How far do I intentionally or unintentionally conform to ideas of what it is to be a man? And how do they show up in how I approach relationship? How do I deal with the shaming I've received and will receive in the future? Does this lead me to shame other people, my partner, my children, to become aggressive or even violent? Or can I transform this energy into something more positive? What about the multiplicity of what I am beyond being a man? The space I make, for instance, of what I or others might regard as my feminine side. Born into masculinity, how does the range of what arouses or excites me relate to what I see as my values, or instead to aspects of mastery? And how far am I at ease with this? If I'm aware of these kind of questions, how not to get caught up in indecision, overthinking? Where does necessary self-criticism slide into unhealthy self-doubt? If I challenge aspects of this masculinity in myself or in other people, how to be a genuine ally in a struggle against something in which I'm inevitably complicit, even though not by my own choosing? In a world where I'm supposed to compete and even to dominate as a man, what might a successful life as a man look like, feel like, in my own terms? Empty. As Zeniths, we might return here to our own direct experiencing on the cushion and to our experiencing of lived relationship. How do I experience my gender and my desiring? Does it all feel simply what I am? Or are there tensions in my experiencing, whether in the thoughts I think, the emotions I feel, or in my body experiencing what I do or don't find exciting, arousing, pleasurable? Or for that matter, what I find horrifying or disgusting? Because intimacy, and including our sexual identity, feelings and expressions as one of the most intimate aspects of ourselves, is where we may feel most truly or deeply me, and whether this is feeling it as simply me, or itself experienced as a place of deep conflict. It's one of the most direct opportunities to experience the fragmentary nature of self and of selfing, and of our illusions of substantiality and certainty. In my awareness of where and how desire does and doesn't find me, and to where it does and doesn't lead, I may perhaps come to experience some sense of the true emptiness of self, and of whatever certainties of identity I hold about myself. Not as any kind of void or lack, but simply as always and only relational, always and only a part of the shared world we collectively, along with all beings, are. We can no more step outside of our desiring or the way gender constructs our culture than we can step outside ourselves. And the relationship of each to each is most intimate. But we can come to be better aware of our experiencing of each and all, which changes everything and nothing. But I'll give the last word here to joy, to pleasure, to the desire for connection that our desire fundamentally is. Mutual pleasure, mutual joy are the very foundation of relationship. And as I become more aware of where and how I am thinking or acting within the dynamic of relationship, it is together that we do this, caring enough to show the other our own vulnerability, our fallibility, our limitations, and to be recognised in them also. This is the ground on which we are able to build relationships beyond the instrumental, beyond it being all about me. To share and to love, which requires us also to accept the darker moments of our relationship. Misunderstanding, even hatred, breakdown. Relationship is no magic wand, and we will continue to fail and fail again. Hopefully to fail better. The question for our relationships and for all relationships is, in the wonder of our sameness and our difference, what might we together become?